On the eve of his hanging, when the jail had gone quiet and even the guard's footsteps faded into the long, uneasy hours before dawn, Elias Crow was left alone with the sound of the wind and the weight of his own name, a name spoken across the territory in whispers thick with fear and rumor, a name tied to burned homesteads, stolen horses, and blood spilled beneath open skies. Yet as he sat on the narrow cot with his wrists free for the first time in years, no chains, no shackles, just the slow creak of the gallows outside his window, he felt less like the outlaw the world believed him to be and more like a tired man who had carried a secret too long. And it was then, as the wind slipped through the wooden beams like a voice searching for an ear, that he began to speak, not loudly, not for anyone in particular, but as if the night itself had been waiting all these years to hear the truth. He spoke of the boy he once was, before the wanted posters, before the gunfire and the long rides under moonless skies, a boy who believed the land could be kind if you worked it honest, a boy who learned early that the West did not care for hope unless it was paid for in loss, and as he spoke his voice did not shake with fear of death but with the quiet strain of memory, because what no one ever knew, what no sheriff, no bounty hunter, no newspaper ever guessed, was that the legend of Elias Crow had been built not from hunger for violence but from a promise made in desperation on a night much like this one, years ago, when the stars were sharp and the ground was cold and he had sworn to become the monster the world needed so that someone else might live free of it. He confessed that his first crime was not theft but mercy, that the first man he ever shot was already dying and begged for a quicker end, and though the law never cared for such details, they had followed him like ghosts, shaping every choice thereafter, because once the blood was on his hands, the path before him narrowed until there was no room left for innocence, only survival. The wind rattled the gallows rope outside, a dry, hollow sound, and Elias smiled faintly as he spoke of how that rope had chased him in dreams for years, how he had woken countless nights convinced this moment had already arrived, yet none of those imagined endings had felt as final as this quiet one, where there was no gun to reach for, no horse to mount, no horizon left to outrun. He spoke then of the woman whose name had never crossed his lips in public, a woman the papers never mentioned because she did not fit the story, a woman who had known him before the scars, before the reputation, and who had seen in him something worth saving even as the world sharpened its knives, and it was for her, he said, that the legend was born, because when the land was taken from her family by men with papers and polished boots, men who called themselves lawful while leaving ruin behind, Elias learned that justice in the West wore many faces and few of them were clean. He confessed that every train robbery, every ambush blamed on greed, had been a message written in smoke and fear, a warning meant for men who believed power made them untouchable, and though innocent folk suffered from the fear his name spread, he had told himself, over and over, that fear was lighter than chains, that terror passed quicker than hunger, that someday the truth would surface and balance the scales. Yet as he spoke now into the empty cell, his certainty wavered, because secrets grow heavier with time, and the weight of his silence pressed harder than any sentence the judge had handed down. He admitted that he had turned away from chances to surrender, from moments when escape would have been easy, because a part of him had always known this was where the road ended, beneath the gallows that now creaked like an old tree in the wind, and he wondered aloud whether the West would be quieter without his name to curse, whether the land would finally rest once the story closed with a clean, simple ending, a bad man brought to justice. Yet even as he questioned it, he revealed the final truth he had never shared, the truth that could fracture the legend entirely, that the worst crime ever laid at his feet, the massacre that sealed his fate, had not been his doing at all, but the work of men who wore badges and smiles and needed a shadow to hide behind, and he had taken that sin upon himself because the woman he loved would have been destroyed by the truth, because the town needed a villain more than it needed honesty, and because the West, in all its wide-open beauty, had never been a place where truth survived without a gun to defend it. As dawn crept closer, pale and uncertain, Elias's voice grew softer, not weaker but calmer, as if unburdening himself had finally loosened the knot inside his chest, and he spoke not to beg forgiveness but to leave something behind, a record carried only by the wind and the waiting sky, trusting that somehow, somewhere, the truth had a way of traveling farther than a man ever could. When he finally fell silent, the cell felt fuller than it had hours before, heavy with words that would never be written down. And as the first light touched the gallows, Elias Crow lay back on the cot, eyes open, breathing slow, no longer running, no longer hiding, having given the Wild West one last confession, dark, quiet, and destined, like so many truths of the frontier, to linger just beyond reach, waiting for the right soul to listen. She arrived in Red Mesa at the hour when The sun hung low and cruel, painting the desert in shades of copper and fire, and from the moment her black dress appeared at the edge of town, carried by a tired horse and a woman who sat straight despite the long road behind her, the air itself seemed to tighten, because everyone there already knew her name even if they pretended not to, and they whispered it behind hands and shuttered windows like a warning passed from one fearful heart to another. Mara Bell, the widow of Red Mesa, the woman. Fate followed like a shadow, the woman whose husbands and lovers had all met violent ends beneath the wide and unforgiving western sky. No one could say where the story truly began, only that it trailed behind her wherever she went, growing darker with each retelling, shaped by superstition and fear, until men crossed the street rather than meet her eyes and shopkeepers hurried their service as if lingering too long might tempt death itself, and Mara felt those looks like heat on her skin as she dismounted and claimed the small adobe house at the edge of town, a place no one else wanted because it stood alone against the desert, wind-scoured and silent, much like the life she had come to accept as her own. She unpacked slowly, methodically, as if order might hold back memory, but memory was stubborn, and as the days passed it rose in quiet moments, the sound of laughter shared once beneath cottonwood trees, the weight of a man's hand warm and alive in hers, the promise she had believed could last, and each memory ended the same way, with blood on dust, with breath leaving a body too soon, with her left standing as the last witness to love cut short, and though the townsfolk called her cursed, Mara knew better, knew that the West was simply hungry and careless with men who carried guns and dreams in equal measure. She kept to herself, earned coin sowing and tending gardens that barely survived the harsh land, and when men did speak to her, their voices were stiff with caution, eyes flicking away as if attraction itself were dangerous, and she told herself she was grateful for that distance, because longing had only ever led her to loss, and she had learned the hard way that solitude, while heavy, was safer than hope. Yet fate, as it always seemed to do, took her careful plans as a challenge, and one night when the heat refused to loosen its grip even after sunset, Mara heard a sound that did not belong to the desert wind, a low, broken groan carried across the sand, and she froze at her door, heart pounding, knowing before she opened it that whatever lay beyond would change everything, because when she stepped outside with a lantern trembling in her hand, she found a man collapsed in the dust, blood dark against his shirt, his revolver fallen just out of reach, his face drawn tight with pain but young enough to still carry softness beneath the grit, and in that instant, all the warnings she had given herself cracked, because leaving him there would mean death, and saving him would mean inviting the very story she had spent years trying to outrun. His name, she learned later as she cleaned and bound his wound, was Jonah Reed, a gunslinger by trade if not by pride, a man who spoke little even when fever loosened his tongue, and as he drifted in and out of consciousness in her spare room, Mara saw not the outlaw the town would later label him but a weary soul shaped by the same relentless land that had taken so much from her, and she told herself she was only doing what any decent person would, yet her hands lingered longer than necessary. Her voice softened in ways she had sworn it never would again, and as Jonah slowly healed beneath her roof, the space between them filled with something unspoken but alive, tension woven from gratitude, curiosity, and a shared understanding of loss that required no explanation. The town noticed, of course, because Red Mesa noticed everything, and soon the whispers returned sharper than before, men shaking their heads and muttering that Jonah Reed was as good as dead, that no one touched Mara Bell and lived long. And Mara heard those rumors like echoes of past funerals, each one tightening the knot in her chest, because she had begun to care in ways that frightened her more than any ghost story, had begun to imagine mornings where Jonah's quiet presence lingered at her table, evenings where the desert did not feel so vast, and it was that fragile hope that made the inevitable feel all the more cruel when danger finally came knocking in the form of men Jonah had once ridden with and then left behind. Men who carried old grudges and fresh violence in equal measure, and when they confronted him in the street beneath the merciless sun, accusing him of betrayal, Mara watched from her doorway with dread pooling in her stomach, knowing she had seen this scene before in other towns, with other men, always ending the same way. Jonah tried to walk away, tried to choose peace, but the West rarely allowed such choices without a price, and when gunfire shattered the afternoon, time seemed to slow, each sound stretching unbearably long, and though Jonah survived that day, the message was clear and written in blood, and as Mara tended to him once more, tears finally breaking free, she begged him to leave, to run while he still could, to not let her name become his epitaph, and Jonah, pale but resolute, took her hand with a gentleness that undid her entirely, telling her that running had cost him everything before and that for the first time, he had found Something worth standing still for. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken goodbyes, with stolen moments charged by the knowledge that happiness, when it came, was often brief in the West, and when Jonah eventually walked out to face the men who hunted him so that Mara would not have to, she stood in the doorway once more, sun blazing overhead, heart breaking open as she realized that loving him had been both the bravest and most foolish thing she had ever done. The town would later tell many versions of what happened next, some saying Jonah rode out and never returned, others claiming he fell somewhere beyond the mesa with Mara's name on his lips, but what none of them truly knew was that love had lived there, briefly and fiercely, beneath the burning western sun, and that Mara Bell, the widow of Red Mesa, carried not a curse but a heart that dared to open again and again despite the cost, standing alone at dusk after the dust settled, grief and pride woven together as tightly as the desert wind, knowing that fate might take her lovers but it could never erase the truth of what they had shared, and that in a land so quick to destroy, loving deeply was the most dangerous and beautiful act of all. Deadwood Crossing had forgotten the sound of law long before the day Thomas Hale rode in beneath a sky the color of old steel, forgotten it so completely that when the townsfolk first saw the lone rider approaching at a slow, deliberate pace, they did not think of justice or protection but of trouble, because in a place where order had died, anything arriving from the horizon usually meant blood, and yet there was something different about this man. Something worn and heavy in the way he sat his horse, shoulders bent not from age but from memory, his coat dust-stained, his hat pulled low, and pinned to his chest, barely catching the light, a badge dulled by years of neglect, a badge he had sworn never to wear again. Thomas Hale did not come to Deadwood Crossing looking to be a hero, did not come seeking redemption or a fight, but the West had a way of dragging men back into the roles they tried hardest to abandon, and as his horse's hoofs echoed down the empty main street, he felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the old ache of responsibility he had buried beneath miles of road and silence, because this town, broken and lawless, looked too much like the one he had failed years before, the one that still haunted his sleep. Deadwood Crossing was ruled now by fear and the quiet agreement that survival meant obedience, with gangs dividing the land like carcass meat and the townsfolk keeping their heads down, doors barred even in daylight, children learning early not to ask questions, and when Thomas dismounted in front of the saloon, eyes followed him from behind cracked windows, curiosity warring with distrust, because a marshal meant rules, and rules meant consequences, and consequences had a way of costing people dearly. The saloon keeper, a woman named Lillian Crow with sharp eyes and a voice worn smooth by hard years, was the first to speak to him, telling him flatly that Deadwood Crossing didn't need saving and didn't want it either, and Thomas believed her, believed that this town, like so many others, had learned to live with its wounds rather than risk reopening them. Yet as he took a room above the saloon and listened that first night to distant gunfire and closer cries quickly silenced, he knew he would not be leaving, because the badge in his pocket felt heavier with every hour, and the ghosts he carried stirred restlessly, whispering that running had already cost him everything once. He remembered that other town, years ago, where he had been younger and surer, where he had believed the law could be enough, where he had promised protection to people who trusted him, and how one wrong choice, one moment of hesitation, had ended in fire and screams and the loss of the woman he loved, a loss that shattered his faith in himself more thoroughly than any bullet ever could, and it was that failure that had driven him away from the badge, away from towns like Deadwood Crossing. Yet here he was, unable to sleep, listening to the same sounds of fear he had once sworn never to ignore again. The next morning, Thomas pinned the badge to his chest and stepped into the street, and though no ceremony marked the moment, though no one cheered or even smiled, the air shifted subtly, because symbols mattered in the West, even broken ones, and by noon the men who truly ruled Deadwood Crossing had noticed him, led by a man called Silas Boone, whose power came not from strength alone but from the certainty that no one would challenge him. And when Boone confronted Thomas with a lazy grin and a hand resting too comfortably near his gun, warning him that marshals tended to have short lives in towns like this, Thomas met his gaze steadily and replied that he was already living on borrowed time. Tension coiled through the days that followed, each encounter sharpening like a blade, as Thomas began the slow, dangerous work of reminding the town what law looked like, breaking up fights, disarming drunks, standing between predators and prey without raising his voice, and though he bled more than once for it, the townsfolk watched in silence as something long dormant stirred, hope creeping back cautiously, afraid to show its face too soon. Children lingered a little longer in the street, shopkeepers spoke a little louder, and Lillian Crow began leaving coffee for him in the mornings without comment, her guarded respect growing with each small stand he took. And yet for all his resolve, Thomas knew what was coming, knew that Boone and his men would not allow this slow shift to continue, because order threatened their rule, and when word spread that Boone was gathering allies from the surrounding Badlands, preparing for open war, fear settled over Deadwood Crossing like a storm cloud, and the townsfolk turned to Thomas with eyes full of questions he did not know how to answer. That night, alone in his room, Thomas confronted the past he had tried to outrun, admitting to himself that courage had never been his problem, but doubt had, doubt born from the belief that his best efforts would only lead to more graves, and as he stared at the badge resting on the table, he finally understood that wearing it had never been about certainty or success, but about standing when it mattered, even if the outcome could not be controlled. The morning Boone rode in with his men, the street filled with dust and menace, and Thomas stood waiting in the open, revolver at his side but not drawn, the silence stretching thick and dangerous as Boone mocked him for his stubbornness, for clinging to a code that had failed him before, and the words cut deeper than any threat because they echoed Thomas's own fears. Yet when Boone demanded he leave or die, Thomas spoke not of lawbooks or authority but of responsibility, of the cost of doing nothing, of the truth that some towns survived not because they were strong but because someone chose to stand between them and ruin. The gunfight that followed was brutal and unforgiving, chaos erupting beneath the harsh sun, and Thomas moved through it with grim focus, every choice deliberate, every step taken with the knowledge that this time, he would not freeze, would not hesitate, would not abandon the people counting on him, and though he was wounded, though pain blurred his vision and blood darkened his sleeve, he kept standing until Boone fell and the remaining men fled, leaving Deadwood Crossing scarred but breathing, the echoes of gunfire fading into a silence unlike any the town had known in years. When it was over, Thomas sank to his knees, exhaustion and grief crashing over him together, because victory did not erase the past, did not bring back what he had lost, but as the townsfolk gathered around him, not cheering but quietly present, offering water, hands, simple gratitude, he felt something ease inside his chest, a burden shifting at last. Deadwood Crossing would not be healed overnight, and Thomas knew his own road might still end badly, but as he looked down the street at faces no longer hiding, he understood that the badge he had once rejected was never meant to save him, only to give him a reason to keep going, and in that understanding, gritty and hard won, the last marshal of Deadwood Crossing found not redemption, but resolve, standing beneath a wide and watchful sky, ready at last to face whatever ghost still rode behind him, deep in Black Canyon, where the sun seemed to lose its warmth and the rock walls rose like broken teeth against the sky. There was said to be a vein of gold so rich it glowed even in darkness, a treasure whispered about in camps and saloons with equal parts hunger and fear, because every story about it ended the same way, not with fortune, but with disappearance, madness, or death, and it was into this uneasy legend that Samuel Pike stumbled not by courage or skill but by desperation, a man worn thin by years of bad luck, empty pockets, and promises the West had never kept, and when he found the map tucked inside a water-damaged Bible at a forgotten trading post, marked with symbols too old and careful to be a prank, he felt the first stirring of hope he had known in years, though it came tangled with a chill he could not explain, as if the canyon itself had taken notice of him. Samuel told no one of the map, not because he was clever but because secrecy had become his last defense against disappointment, and as he packed his mule and turned toward the desert, he convinced himself that the stories were nothing more than warnings meant to scare weak men away from opportunity, the kind of tales the frontier thrived on. Yet the further he traveled, the heavier the air seemed to grow, the land stretching wide and empty in a way that made him feel watched, and it was on the second night, camped beneath a sky crowded with stars, that he first heard the whisper, not a sound carried by wind, but something closer, nearer, as if spoken just behind his thoughts, promising rest, promising reward, promising that his suffering was nearly over. Samuel jolted awake, heart racing, telling himself it was only the desert playing tricks. Yet when the whisper returned the next night, clearer and more patient, calling him by name, he could no longer deny that something was following him, something that knew his hunger and fed upon it gently, almost kindly, reminding him of debts unpaid, of years spent digging holes that yielded nothing but dust, of a life slipping away without leaving a mark. And with every mile closer to Black Canyon, the voice grew stronger, weaving itself into his thoughts until it felt less like an intrusion and more like a companion. When he finally reached the canyon's edge, the land fell away sharply, shadows pooling thick and deep between the rock walls, and Samuel felt a moment of doubt so sharp it nearly sent him turning back, because the place felt wrong in a way words could not shape, silent not with peace but with waiting, and as he stood there clutching the map, He remembered all the men whose names had faded into rumor after chasing the same promise, yet the whisper urged him forward, softer now, almost tender, telling him that those men had failed because they had not listened, because they had tried to take without understanding the price. The descent into Black Canyon was slow and treacherous, each step echoing too loudly against the stone, and Samuel found himself speaking aloud just to break the silence, his voice sounding small and strange in the narrow space. And when he reached the canyon floor, he saw signs that others had been there before him: rusted tools, collapsed tunnels, scraps of cloth bleached pale by time, and though fear tightened his chest, excitement burned brighter, because these were the remains of men who had come close, men who had touched the edge of something extraordinary. And as he followed the map deeper into the canyon, the whispers began to change, no longer content to merely promise, now asking questions, probing his past, reminding him of moments he had buried beneath years of failure, and Samuel answered them without realizing he was doing so, confessing regrets and envies into the empty air, feeling oddly lighter with each admission, as if the canyon itself were listening. When he found the vein at last, exposed in a narrow cleft of rock, glowing faintly as if lit from within, he fell to his knees in awe, because no story had done it justice, the gold running thick and pure, unmarred by stone, a fortune waiting to be claimed. And as his hands trembled over it, the whisper swelled into a presence he could feel pressing close, no longer hiding its nature, telling him that this was the devil's gold, not because it belonged to evil, but because it demanded truth, because it stripped men bare and weighed their souls as carefully as they weighed the metal. And Samuel laughed then, a brittle sound, insisting that he had nothing left to lose, that the West had already taken everything that mattered. Yet even as he said it, memories rose unbidden, faces of people he had wronged in small, careless ways, chances at kindness he had traded for pride, moments when he had chosen himself at the expense of others, and the present seemed to feed on those memories, growing warmer, closer, as if drawing strength from his acknowledgement. The first nugget he pried free felt heavier than gold should, its weight pulling at his arm, and with it came a rush of certainty so intense it left him breathless, visions of comfort and respect flashing before his eyes, and he worked feverishly then, filling his sack, ignoring the way the canyon seemed to darken, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, because the whisper urged him on, telling him that he deserved this, that suffering earned reward, that the world would finally recognize his worth. Hours passed unnoticed until exhaustion forced him to stop, and when he tried to lift the sack, he found it far heavier than before, not just with gold but with something unseen, a pressure that bent his spine and made each breath laborious. And as he struggled, the whisper spoke plainly at last, telling him the price had come due, that the gold demanded not his life but his direction, his purpose, binding him to the canyon until the weight of what he carried matched the weight of who he was. And panic surged through him as he realized that every step away from the vein pulled harder, as if the canyon itself resisted his leaving. Samuel dropped the sack and staggered back, shouting into the stone that this was not what he had agreed to, that there had been no bargain, and the presence responded not with anger but with something like disappointment, reminding him that he had listened willingly, that desire itself was consent. And in that moment, Samuel understood the true curse of Black Canyon, that it did not kill men outright but hollowed them slowly, trapping them between what they wanted and what they could carry. And as dawn crept faintly into the canyon, revealing the countless marks of past struggles etched into the rock, he saw that many before him had made the same choice, had tried to leave with more than they could bear and had paid in ways no story fully captured. Weakened and shaking, Samuel made a decision born not of bravery but clarity, and with trembling hands he scattered the gold back into the cleft, each piece leaving him lighter, freer, the whisper fading with every surrender, until at last there was only silence, deep and watchful but no longer pressing close. And as he climbed out of Black Canyon with nothing but the map and his life, he felt changed in ways he could not yet name, stripped raw but still breathing. And when he reached the open desert and the sun touched his face fully once more, he burned the map without hesitation, watching it curl into ash carried away by the wind. Years later, men would still speak of the devil's gold of Black Canyon, of voices that followed prospectors and riches that demanded terrible prices. And Samuel Pike would sometimes hear those stories from a distance, keeping his head down and his hands honest, knowing that some fortunes were not meant to be owned, only survived, and that the West, in all its mystery and cruelty, did not curse men out of malice but out of truth, offering them exactly what they asked for, and asking in return only that they be strong enough to walk away.